Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing great. How are you, sir?
Good. For those of you who I know we have a lot of listeners and watchers, but for those of you joining us for the first time, also for your returning guests, the goal here for us on the So What podcast is to answer that real hard question of so what. We ask hard questions when it comes to technology, GovCon, etc. And I'm lucky enough every week to be joined by someone a lot smarter than me, Will Lester. Thank you for
I mean,
joining. And again, the goal for us is to discuss the topic and get to that ultimate so what. So with that, Will, thank you so much for joining. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
well, sure. Thank you, Benny. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today. So, Will Lester, I lead our engineering efforts at NTS. I've been here for about 5 years now. Held various roles at the company from on-site engineer to program manager to business development and capture to running our R&D recently, and then now taking over all of engineering. So, really passionate about technology, but also the intersection of people and taking care of relationships and the customer ultimately.
Yeah, we
So.
can't do anything technology related without people and having those people perform. So I appreciate you, Will. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your time. Our topic today, and this is something I know that's near and dear to your heart, is edge as code, right? And great concept, great conversation. I know a lot of people talk cloud, cloud, cloud. In fact, a lot of the conversations that are happening out there are the two C words, right? It's cyber and cloud. But edge has a lot to do with both of those. So in order to kick it off, edge as code, how do we even get here? How do we even begin this conversation?
Sure. So I think it wasn't that long ago that cloud was the new hotness. I think in a lot of cases, people are still very interested in cloud. The commercial industry is very interested in cloud from an elasticity of demand perspective. Right, they're able to stand up infrastructure very quickly. Whether you're building the next Twitter or the next Instagram or whatever, you don't want to have to build a global network of servers and networks and things like that to reach your customers. And so the cloud becomes this capability, this opportunity to do that in this scale up and scale down world. And in order to do that, right, the traditional approach to technology has been to stand up a new server, to stand up a new application. There's this 50-page run book of steps where an engineer has to sit through and hand jam all of the different things to stand up an application. Well, in the global economy and the scale up and scale down mentality of the cloud, you can't really afford to do that. And so, what industry came up with was this idea of infrastructure as code. How do I define all of those capabilities in a declarative framework that lets me spin up services and spin down services without somebody hand jamming on the keyboard?
When you say infrastructure as code, I think, or excuse me, edge as code, I think to your point, it spurs from the idea of infrastructure as code. So don't hand jam it, use a more programmatic way of doing it. I think one of the things we have to, the term that I'm using more and more nowadays is the idea of demystify, right? Because I think in our world, in the technology world in particular, we say a lot of these isms and we talk about these concepts without a lot of real, especially in initial conversation, with a lot of meat to the conversation. So edge as code, help me with the as code, because when you say as code, it could be, are we talking about COBOL? We're talking about basic. What are we talking about here? What does as code mean?
Yeah, so definitionally, if you look at the concept of infrastructure as code, I'm kind of a sucker for a definition. So if you take the word infrastructure, two words, infra and structure. Infra means underneath, right? So infrared is underneath the visual
Mm-hmm.
spectrum of light. So whatever's underneath and the structure that you build underneath, those are pretty easy words to understand when we think about roads and power grids and things like that are infrastructure. In the IT world, it might be servers or other primitives. Networking, storage, compute, those types of deals that are underneath the hood, and sometimes even extended up to the application layer. So infrastructure, right, the basis of what we need to build to support what we need to do, right, because the roads aren't the point of your mission, right? The getting to where you're going is the point. The
Right.
infrastructure is what helps you get there. And so the infrastructure as code, code is typically any kind of a plain text, human readable format, something that you can very cleanly understand. What does this do? What are the components? How does this break down? What's the architecture that goes into this? So take all of that infrastructure and then define it with human readable, understandable, version controllable code, not a 50-page run book of how to build the service.
That's a different concept. That's a shift, right? In the last 20 years, infrastructure was, we had infrastructure engineers, we had sysadmins and people who understood the server architecture and the network architecture. Are you saying that with this idea of infrastructure as code, and ultimately we're talking about today, edge as code, that there should be a different way of doing this? Do we not need those people anymore? Is this a different skill set, or how do you actually enact this? How do you enable this in an organization? Is it technology, people, process, all the above?
It's a bit all of the above, right? The various silos of IT have been a challenge for a long time in terms of agility and being able to make change. And so, for a specific task that you may need to do, you may need to get 5 different tickets worked on by 5 different departments. And the idea of infrastructure as code, and now even the DevOps, DevSecOps concept is to how do we bridge those gaps? How do we bring those silos together? Set up process, right, that helps people apply infrastructure dynamically, right? Declare it in code in a way that everybody can understand. And the other C word you mentioned, the cyber folks, can really clearly articulate and repeat to make the building of that infrastructure according to spec, according to that's repeatable, that's reliable, that's trainable.
So we've been manufacturing cars in America for a long time. And one of the things I always found fascinating about the car manufacturing process is that as good as they are and as good as they've gotten worldwide, whether it's an American manufacturer or an import, there's still recalls. And these recalls typically are very arduous, right? Hey, something happened where you now need to bring that vehicle to a dealership, change something out, and then move on. So that to me was the old way of doing business for cars, right? And recalls. And unless it and that's kind of the way that it was done in quote IT world. If something was broken, if something was busted, you got to put hands on, you got to have someone rebuild it, redo it, restart it. So just recently, Tesla China had a report come out, a safety report come out that said when turning, based on how the steering is set up and based on how the controls are set up, you could accelerate the car, right? As you were turning the car, you were going to go hit your turn signal. There could be an acceleration because of how the cruise control setup was. Well, Tesla says there's 230,000 cars affected by this, or 280,000 cars. Don't quote me on the number, but they issued a recall. The way they fixed the recall was an over-the-air update to all the Teslas that were affected. Right? Is that a good parallel to kind of what you're talking about? The idea of infrastructure as code, be able to say, hey, look, we want to be able to take those changes and be able to make that change on the fly and declare this is what needs to be fixed. This is what we're going to do, or we need to reinstall the OS as an example. Is that too far of a stretch, or is that kind of along the same lines? And I'd like to dissect that a little bit because I know I'm probably oversimplifying it, but that's kind of how I work.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made that there's some things you could connect there. The hardware to software discussion. Not all hardware problems can be fixed in software.
Sure.
But there is a case to be made for that. One of the interesting things about infrastructure as code in particular is that in a lot of ways that infrastructure can be ephemeral, right? So it can be both ephemeral, so disposable. I can tear it down and rebuild it at any time without much pain. A Tesla you probably can't tear down and rebuild
Sure.
at the hardware level, but the software stack, if that's something that can be brought in and torn down and pulled out into its different pieces and refactored and put back together, and used as the basis for the future, I think that would be a good fit for infrastructure as code in that regard.
So just to kind of walk that journey so far, the world changed because of a lot of different reasons, right? The ask of technology became not a afterthought, but it became a part of the way of life, right? Whether it's business, whether it was government, whether it was you trying to find out where your stimulus check was, or whether you were trying to log in and post a picture, right? It just became a way of life. So technology dependence became really the framework of why all these companies had to make these changes. So whether it was Facebook or Twitter or Google, they had to respond to customers, us, right? We were asking a lot. They had to respond. And in order to respond, they figured out different ways of doing what they were already doing. And it couldn't be done the old way. It couldn't be done with just tens and 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people trying to maintain and manage all these servers and manage and maintain all this infrastructure. So they had to figure out a different way. They can't grow to the scale that they're at without that. Along that journey, what they also understood, and again, this is how I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a lot of benefits that come from that. Speed, agility, the ability to respond to changes in the environment, changes to the business environment, changes to the mission environment, but also things like security, also things like compliance, also things like, hey, all of a sudden, we now have a new threat we need to respond to. What are you going to do? Send people everywhere and physically fix the infrastructure, or be able to fix it from a code standpoint? and not decouple those things so hard so that it's one or the other, but look at the whole infrastructure as code, including that edge. So would you say then that lesson learned, those lessons learned are then being pulled down to the edge because, for the last X number of years, a lot of those innovations have started in the cloud, started with the hyperscalers and then pushed back down. Would you say edge is a cloud concept in your world or a non-cloud concept in your world? And this is a little bit of a trick question.
Sure. I think the idea that we're pushing is the idea of taking the cloud native technologies, the things we've talked about, like infrastructure as code and Kubernetes and other containerized platforms that treat infrastructure that way, and exporting them to the edge, and bringing them to the edge. Not necessarily. So if you look at our kind of our cloud approach over the last decade or so, we kind of started out with let's just move everything to the cloud. Let's lift and shift. Let's do a cloud migration. Cloud. And then some folks said, hey, some of those apps aren't ready to go to the cloud. And then the new edict was, well, any new development needs to be cloud first. And those kind of came out. And then as folks came forward and said, hey, we have this edge thing. In a DoD sense, a denied environment, a DDIL environment, we don't always have that connectivity. What about us? The concept kind of shifted to how do we do service projection? How do we take applications from the cloud, project them out to the edge, and then repatriate the data whenever we get around to it, so that we can still operate in that way. The new wave of cloud to edge that we're really latching onto is taking those methodologies and in the cloud native, the infrastructure as code, the ephemeral and disposable infrastructure, and immutable infrastructure, and exporting that to the edge. Because a lot of the challenges, like you mentioned a minute ago, with the hyperscale folks, the Facebooks and Twitters and Instagram, they don't have time to babysit a system. Mm-hmm. So if there's a particular server, and the way this works a lot of times in the DoD is, or even in enterprise, we built something and maybe it broke or it didn't work quite right, but we did something else to fix it and to patch it. And it took us, a bunch of manual steps and troubleshooting to get it to a point where it was functional. And now nobody wants to touch it. Right. Because, if we touch it, you might break it. Don't breathe on it. Don't even turn it off. Leave it on. And what that does is it hampers that agility. It hampers their ability to go faster. They don't want to upgrade it, to the newest version of software, to the newest patches, because at any point it could break. Right. So they treat it almost like a pet. They treat it like something that's precious, as opposed to the infrastructure as code model that the hyperscale providers have adopted is just shoot it and start over. Right. Burn it down, rebuild it, and then you have a known good baseline. And if something changes, you change the baseline. And then instead of trying to patch and spoon feed that system to get it up to the new snuff, you wipe it and start over. And that's the way. That's what's enabled the hyperscale folks to do what they do and adapt to the changing landscape of planetary scale for Facebook.
I like that term, planetary scale. I'm gonna steal that from you. But to touch on that, you said earlier the goal is to take some of the stuff, or what we've learned so far is we take some of those lessons learned, those technologies in that cloud environment and quote export them to the edge. But that's not easy, right? That's not like you can't just pick up that stuff, that code, and just say, okay, well, I'm going to put it on the edge. There's expertise behind that, and I think that's what a lot of people are finding. Do you want to kind of talk through that a little bit, because that's what I'm hearing, what I'm feeling?
Absolutely. So and the planetary scale phrase is borrowed from Kubernetes, so you can give them credit for that one. What we saw is kind of similar to what we saw with the migration to cloud, when we said some of the applications aren't ready to go to cloud. Some of the legacy infrastructure, whether it's routers and switches and firewalls and other things, aren't ready to go to the cloud native structure. They're not purpose built. So if you look at what our friends at HashiCorp and others are doing around infrastructure as code, it's very much a cloud first, cloud centric approach. Mm-hmm. And because that's where the scale is needed. That's where the point of need was in the beginning. And now we're trying to take that lesson and apply it to the edge. And what we're finding is there's a lot of legacy down at the edge, just in the way there was legacy in the application space that we tried to move. So it takes a lot of understanding of those primitives, of the network, of the storage, of the of the compute requirements at the edge, to take those models and permutate them to work in an edge environment.
So are you contending, Will, that over time, especially as the edge evolves, as it gets more complex, as cloud becomes a way of doing things, not just a place to do things, that there will be, an edge expert, just like there's a cloud expert, if you will? Because right now, if you peruse job boards, you go look at what people are hiring for, you go look at open positions and titles. It's cloud architect, it's director of cloud, it's cloud this. Do you think there becomes a point where the edge is just as important and there's someone who is the edge architect? There is someone who is the edge operations manager, not just a cloud operations manager? Or do you think it always is a subset of what cloud is?
Well, I think the understanding of cloud is a little misguided in some ways, where the cloud is not a magical thing, right? The same primitives that exist at the edge, whether it's storage, compute, networking, are in the data center in a cloud, right? If you go to Amazon data centers, you're going to see, you might see some extra FPGAs and GPUs and other services that they offer because of their scale, but it's drives and storage and networking and all of the same things, right? So um, the disciplines of the cloud are applicable to the edge because they're similar in terms of their primitives. They just have different software stacks, right? And more that software stack is being standardized into Kubernetes, whether that's OpenShift or Rancher or Homegrown, whatever that looks like, Anthos or some of the other capabilities. But that Kubernetes is becoming the lingua franca of the edge. Even it's still not quite there. There's still some work to be done, I think, to find all those legacy edge endpoints. But I think those skill sets are going to merge in the future. Today, they're not necessarily there, right? You're still dealing with legacy infrastructure.
Do you think that's also why the concept of edge as code is that much more important? Because you necessarily, as you merge those two skill sets, as there's more overlap between the technologies, Kubernetes, containerization, software defined X, do you think there's more because of that, the idea of infrastructure as code, infrastructure as edge becomes that much more important, becomes more of a baseline. No longer will it be a thing that we will do. It's a thing that it's basically how we do, right? It's the normal operating procedure for more businesses, more organizations, governments, et cetera. Um, do you see a path there, or do you see that it's not looked at that level yet? Do you think people really understand how important the edge concept is to really making the cloud model work?
I think if I've learned anything in technology over the last number of years is that we will always be in a transition, whether that's the pendulum swinging to the cloud or swinging back to the edge or vice versa. We're always going to live in that space, and I firmly believe that the future of the space is software defined. It's going to be software driven. It's going to be declared in code so that we can express the intent, right? Whether it's intent based networking or whatever that is, software SD-WAN, whatever, in that way. Now, as we transition, we're going to need to work through the legacy challenges of existing infrastructure and those types of things. And there will be a time in which that stuff hopefully modernizes and gets us to the point where it is more cloud native in its behavior. So what I think is interesting about edge as code in particular, or edge infrastructure as code, is that if you lay the groundwork now with some of your legacy systems, when those systems at the edge become more capable of, or maybe more natively cloud native, to mince words, you'll be able to repatriate that technology back to the cloud. So as you put these investments into edge as code, you can reap the benefits in the cloud as code just at the same time, and then give yourself a single pane of management and a single way of doing things. So you don't have a silo of cloud people and a silo of edge people, right? You just have an infrastructure. You have a service mesh, an enterprise that doesn't really matter where it's physically located. You're still going to use the same methodologies moving forward. And I think the cloud native methodology is going to win. So might as well take that to the edge and apply that now.
So, second to last question for you before we get to the big one. How do you get there, right? How do you start? What do you do? And I know that's a long conversation, but what in some of the things that you've seen and some of the projects that you've been involved in, trying to help a customer or an organization get from where they are now to really understanding and embracing edge as code, what are some of those steps, some of those both cultural and also technology changes that you have to make? Because that's what people want. People want to be able to say, okay, if I want to do this, what do I need to do? How do I get started?
I think step one is to start. I think we always think that we need some large excuse or large program to get going, but most organizations are doing infrastructure as code, or at least an automation or orchestration at some level, whether that's a single person with a script, a folder full of scripts on their desktop, or a folder on SharePoint, God forbid, with different scripts and baselines in it. There are pockets of this going on in all kinds of units across the DoD and the enterprise, and in the IC world especially. So I think acknowledging that that's the case, and then making sure that the tooling and the platform for that to move forward is started to lay the groundwork for. So having things like version control with things like GitLab, or places to put the code so it's accessible, so you can start building a repository of capabilities that you can then layer on task orchestration tools like Ansible Tower to pull those scripts and playbooks out, and then having sources of truth using things like Netbox, where you can define how your network should be in code, and then convert all those toolings together. So I think it's a starting process. It's a finding out what you have. It's a discovery of what you have, and then looking at how do you, because everyone wrote those scripts to solve a need, right? They had a problem, they wrote a script, they did a thing to make their job easier. How do we make sure that we propagate that throughout the enterprise? And then as that evolves, you can then take that into more areas. You can mature it and start doing things like test-driven infrastructure development, where you have models of the network, and you can apply a change through a pull request in Git instead of a putty SSH into a switch to see what happens. Maybe you can run a test before you apply it to production, using a CI/CD pipeline, like something inside of GitLab.
You know what's interesting? Funny is probably not the term, but ironic is probably the term. When you talk to infrastructure, what I call traditional infrastructure people, folks that are either hands-on on the networking side, or hands-on on the sysadmin server infrastructure side, DBAs, what I always hear initially is, hey, we're just, we're infrastructure people. I don't want to talk about code. I don't want to talk about code. When you go sit down with them, you really start to talk about what they do. Every single one of them has a toolbox full of scripts, little shortcuts that they've written, back in the day, macros that they created to make something easier. DBAs,
Which aren't secure, by the way, right?
yeah,
There's nobody checking to make sure those are safe ways of operating.
but they all have them. So they're doing this. They need to operationalize it. They need to embrace it on a larger level, and make it a kind of a fabric versus a break fix. So it's that initial conversation. I think that wall always goes up. Well, I'm not a code person. I'm not a developer. And I don't think what you're prescribing is for your infrastructure people to be necessarily, quote, developers, but to be able to understand what are those actions that need to be taken. How do you then put that in a declarative language? How do you then put that in a process so that people can make it very, very easy to use, automated, if you will, right? Orchestrated, so I can say I need this to happen, and it kind of takes care of itself. You still need that skill set because these folks understand the infrastructure, and then be able to slowly shepherd them into this idea. Well, there's a better way to declare what the framework looks like versus you having to hand jam it every time. So I think there's that initial resistance, but from what I've seen in folks that I've talked to, they have skill sets, and it's now retooling a little bit, maybe learning something new, maybe getting out there and learning Python. But most infrastructure folks, I think, will probably appreciate things like Python so that they can make that job easier. They were doing scripting 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50, 100, not 100 years ago, but it's been around, right? It's been something that they're doing. So it's interesting when we talk about, quote, scripting and the infrastructure folks, it's that initial wall will go down when you start to have that conversation. So
Yeah, I think one of the challenges there that we see, or what we found, is a lot of times those infrastructure people are not doing high level infrastructure work. They're doing remedial, day to day. I need a new VLAN. I need a new server. I need a new application. They're not actually doing their smart people things.
hmm,
They're doing very menial, repetitive, even error prone tasks that are ripe for automation. They're ripe for infrastructure as code models. So let your smart people do smart people stuff, right? Don't ask them to do, stuff that can be easily automated. So we can kind of raise the quality of their time so they get to do the fun stuff instead of the silly stuff, or waiting for a progress bar, or waiting for, something to install.
it's interesting. I think that's a concept that we don't talk about enough, or I don't hear enough, which is the idea isn't to replace anybody, isn't to replace your high level smart people is to take those things that they should be spending time on, right? And be able to say, you shouldn't spend time on, like you said, getting a VLAN or something on the server side. It's those higher level things, spend the time and automate or infrastructure as code or edge as code, those other pieces to give you some of that time and freedom back. So that's a really, really good, interesting point. Cause again, I don't think that's talked about enough.
No, and I think COVID taught us that we're probably one deep in a lot of places. There may be one smart guy or smart gal that can do a particular task, and if they're out sick or not in the office that day, you might be stuck. And so, being able to introduce a little bit of automation, a little bit of automated testing before they apply the change could let you, balance the load a little bit better across your personnel.
That's a really good point. I think COVID, especially in the automation side, infrastructure as code side, was was probably helped people transform faster than anything else before it, right? To get there faster. All right, sir. Now comes the infamous, famous question. This is all great. Great talk, great discussion. If you were able to encompass this and kind of give it to me in one, so what, right? What is that? So what? Why do people care? Why should they care? Um, that's the bottom line.
Absolutely. I think why people should care is that the cloud isn't going anywhere. The methodologies and the way of doing business in the cloud is going to win out. It's going to be the way of the world moving forward. And the edge has been this place where a lot of innovation can still happen. A lot of the data gets processed and captured and collected still at the edge. And that's where the users are. And so being able to improve the way that we do business at the edge increases the agility of the organization to respond to the next threat, whether that be a near peer adversary in the DoD sense, or domestic terror or whatever that would look like. Being able to prepare for that and be agile to do those things at the edge is going to require doing business differently. And I think edge as code, edge infrastructure as code is the way to do that.
I think it's inevitable, right? It has to, in order to keep up with the speed of business, the speed of mission, the speed of change that's out there now. You can't keep doing business at the edge the way that you used to, but yet want to leverage cloud on the other side at that velocity, at that speed. So,
Right. The elasticity and the scalability that we loved about the cloud, right? That then followed to the infrastructure as code. But now if we're able to take the infrastructure as code models and bring them to the edge, we can now do the elasticity at the edge. We can do the scaling, the flexible consumption model that you love about the cloud, you can now do at the edge because you're able to tear down and build up those services on demand rather than, waiting and keeping them in a connex somewhere.
very well said. So, Mr. Will Lester, thank you again, sir. This was we're right at the time mark, but again, very, very informative, very good. I don't think this is a one segment conversation. I think this is probably something worthy of a series that we can start breaking some of these edge concepts down. The idea of edges code, being able to talk about the framework. How do you get started? Some of the lessons learned, I think we should probably incorporate into the next set of series or the next series of the podcast. What do you think?
Happy to talk about it.
All right, sir. Thank you again. I appreciate your time. Thank you all for watching. One thing I always ask is good or bad. We love comments. We love feedback. We want to know if we're hitting the mark, not hitting the mark. If we are able to answer more questions, please engage with us. Let us know if we're actually answering some of these questions that you have. Thank you again.